The fluorescent lights hummed their endless monotone as Megan O'Brien pushed through the staff entrance at 6:56 a.m., 43 minutes before the shift officially began. Nobody noticed her. That was the point. Her navy scrubs were pressed with military precision, creases sharp enough to draw blood, and her ID badge hung at exactly the same angle it had yesterday and the day before that. The ER corridors at St. Michael's in Denver smelled like antiseptic layered over stale coffee and something darker underneath, fear, maybe, or just the accumulated weight of human suffering that soaked into the walls after 30 years of emergency medicine. She moved past the nursing station without acknowledging the two nurses already stationed there, their voices bright with the false energy of early shift change, and headed directly to the supply closet where her locker waited. The door clicked shut behind her. Alone. Finally alone. Her hands, which had held a 17-year-old kid's intestines in her bare palms while the medevac helicopter rotors screamed overhead, trembled slightly as she opened her locker. Not from fear. From restraint. The folded flag sat in the back corner, wrapped in a blue jacket, bloodstains still visible on the stars even after 8 months. She didn't touch it. Not here. Not where someone might walk past and see the tears she wouldn't let fall. She straightened, pressed her palms flat against her thighs, and felt the trembling stop. Muscle memory. The same technique she'd used in Tikrit when she'd carried Commander Harris through enemy fire for 800 meters to the extraction point. Steady hands. Empty face. That was Captain Megan O'Brien's entire existence now. The ER came alive at 7:15 a.m. when the night shift finally handed off their disasters to the day crew. Megan stood at her assigned computer station, reviewing the overnight admissions log with the kind of focused intensity that made the other nurses keep their distance. She had been a ghost at St. Michael's for 14 months. 14 months of being ignored, underestimated, and quietly excellent at a job she'd taken under circumstances nobody here would ever understand. The security clearance the Pentagon had authorized, the classified reason she'd requested this specific hospital, the fact that she was monitoring opioid diversion patterns in the veteran ward while posing as a travel nurse from Seattle, none of it mattered if anyone actually paid attention to her. Invisibility was her job. Competence was her camouflage. She pulled up the new admissions from the night shift and saw it immediately. Room 347. Commander Harris. The name hit her chest like a 3-round burst from an M16. She read the admission notes with careful, methodical precision. Catastrophic wound pattern. Traumatic brain injury secondary to blast fragmentation. DNR discussion pending due to severity of injuries and prognosis. Transferred from Regional Trauma Center. Expected survivability less than 15%. The ER doors burst open at 7:38 a.m. with the arrival of the incoming helicopter transport. 2 paramedics wheeled the stretcher, one already calling out vitals in that clipped, efficient tone that meant everyone involved knew they were running against a clock. Blood loss. Respiratory compromise. Suspected tension pneumothorax. The trauma bay erupted into controlled chaos, and Megan moved toward room 347 without being asked. She already knew. She'd known the moment she saw the name on the admission log. Commander Harris lay on the stretcher with his eyes closed, his chest wrapped in emergency field dressing that was already saturated with blood. The left side of his rib cage was bandaged with what looked like hastily applied trauma gauze. Blast injuries never looked like what people thought they would look like. They looked like someone had taken a piece of him and scattered it across the desert floor, and the surgeons had done their best to gather up what remained and stuff it back into a uniform. Megan approached his right side, where his arm lay exposed, and there it was. A tattoo in simple block letters across the inside of his forearm, Meg. Her jaw tightened. Just for a half second. Just enough for her to feel the muscles clench beneath her skin. Then her face went blank again, and she reached for his wrist to assess the radial pulse. The skin was cool. Capillary refill running long. Blood pressure already compromised. She didn't speak. Speech would be a mistake. Speech would convey recognition, concern, the kind of personal investment that didn't belong in a professional hospital assessment. Instead, she positioned herself at the for-access site and began setting up the rapid infuser protocol while Dr. Patterson, the attending on trauma call, barked orders to the residents. 2 units of O negative, wide open. Get a femoral line if we can't get a second peripheral. EKG. Chest X-ray portable. Megan moved with the kind of smooth, economical precision that came from having done this exact thing in a combat hospital tent in Anbar province while artillery fire shook the walls. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. The 14-gauge needle went into the antecubital vein on the first attempt, blood flowing back into the catheter like dark rust, and she had him connected to the rapid infuser hanging and running wide open before Patterson even finished his initial assessment. The monitor began tracking his heart rhythm, sinus tachycardia, elevated but organized, and for just a moment, Megan allowed herself to believe that maybe, possibly, there was still a world where things didn't have to end the way everyone's paperwork was predicting they would. But then the ER doors opened again, and Dr. Pierce arrived for morning rounds. His footsteps preceded him, the expensive leather shoes clicking against the tile floor in a rhythm that sounded like a metronome marking someone's countdown to execution. Pierce was tall, with the kind of jawline that suggested old money and newer arrogance, and he carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who had never once been told he was wrong in a way that actually mattered. He was wearing a pressed white coat over designer clothes, and his stethoscope hung around his neck like a symbol of tribal authority rather than a medical instrument. He paused at the entrance to room 347, taking in the scene with clinical detachment, then turned and walked directly toward the nursing station where Megan was documenting Harris's vital signs into the computer. She didn't look up. Looking up would be a mistake. Looking up would acknowledge that she knew he was there, which would open a door that was better left closed. Pierce positioned himself directly beside her, leaning against the counter with a kind of studied casualness that meant he was already planning what he wanted to say. Nurses from technical schools always struggle with the notation, he said loudly enough for the 12 medical residents trailing behind him to hear. Not to her. To them. The observation was directed entirely at his audience, not at her. Megan's fingers continued moving across the keyboard. She was documenting Harris's initial assessment, the triage vitals, the timestamp of medication administration, facts, numbers, the clean language of hospital medicine that left no room for interpretation or error. See how she's recorded the blood pressure. Pierce leaned over, close enough that she could smell his cologne, expensive and somehow aggressive in the sterile air of the ER. Notation like this is exactly what happens when we lower our hiring standards to fill nursing shortages with warm bodies. One of the residents laughed, a nervous sound, quickly cut short when Patterson glanced in their direction. Megan finished typing the last vital sign. O2 sat 78%. Heart rate 124. Blood pressure 86/54 and dropping. Facts. Data. The information that would determine whether Commander Harris lived to see another day or whether she'd be attending his funeral with a face that looked appropriately sad while carrying the kind of grief that never really left your chest cavity. She didn't flinch. That was the important part. The flinch was what Pierce was hunting for. The moment when her shoulders would round inward, when her jaw would tighten, when something in her face would betray the fact that his words had landed. She denied him that moment. Her shoulders remained straight. Her jaw remained neutral. Her fingers continued moving across the keyboard as if Pierce were a piece of hospital furniture rather than a man deliberately positioning his colleagues to doubt her clinical judgment. Real medical training versus correspondence course credentials, Pierce continued, moving now to address the residents more directly. You'll see this pattern frequently as you progress through your careers. The technically trained nurses, they're competent at procedure, at following protocols that others have designed. But clinical judgment? Pattern recognition? The ability to synthesize complex diagnostic data into treatment decisions? That requires a different level of training. The kind that doesn't come from a 2-year program. He turned back to look at Megan's documentation one more time. I'd recommend you each validate her assessments independently. Don't take them at face value. That's not disrespect, that's due diligence. Pierce then moved on to the next patient's room, his entourage of residents trailing behind him like planets orbiting a particular kind of dying star. Megan finished her documentation. Room 347 was assigned to her for the shift. She had 4 hours to keep Captain Commander Harris alive. For hours to watch someone she'd carried through hell struggle for breaths his lungs couldn't deliver. For hours to do her job while the attending physician systematically worked to ensure that nobody in this hospital would trust her clinical judgment even if she somehow managed to save this man's life. The other nurses avoided eye contact. That was new. That was the real damage. The eyes, the careful positioning of their bodies, the way they suddenly became very interested in their phones when she approached the station, that was what Pierce had accomplished. Not through anything loud or dramatic. Through simple, relentless poisoning of perception. Through the kind of institutional authority that didn't require evidence, just suggestion. Just the weight of a man in an expensive coat saying the word warm bodies and watching everyone around her suddenly believe it, even though she'd been working 12-hour shifts at this hospital without a single medication error for over a year. Megan moved toward room 347, where Commander Harris lay with his eyes still closed, his body working overtime to pump blood through veins that were already starting to fail. She didn't know that the next person to walk through those doors would be a Marine liaison officer carrying a classified file. She didn't know that her temporary position in this hospital was about to be revealed as part of a larger assignment that went significantly higher than the standard Bureau of Medicine Affairs security reviews. She didn't know that the folded flag in her locker was about to become the most important piece of evidence in a case that would eventually end with Dr. Pierce teaching CPR certification courses at a community college for minimum wage, his medical license suspended pending criminal review for what the federal investigators would eventually discover was a consistent pattern of dismissing veteran recommendations and systematically undermining the clinical judgment of former military personnel. All she knew was that Commander Harris was dying. That she had 4 hours. That the work in front of her required the kind of hands-on clinical attention that protocols couldn't teach and that credentials couldn't measure. She positioned herself at his bedside and began her assessment, and somewhere deep inside her chest, beneath the layers of military composure and professional detachment, something that had been cold for 14 months began to warm again, driven by the simple fact that this man had once carried her name on his arm, and she would be damned if she'd let him die on a hospital stretcher while everyone else was looking the wrong direction. The vending machine hummed its electric lullaby as Megan fed quarters into the slot. Her fingers were steady, they were always steady, but the fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in that hospital pallor that made even healthy skin look septic. She pressed B7. Coffee. Black. Nothing else. That's when she heard the voices around the corner. Pierce warned me about relying on O'Brien's clinical judgment. It was Jennifer, one of the ICU nurses Megan had personally trained 6 months ago. Said he's building a file to protect the hospital from her incompetence. The second voice was softer, uncertain. Building a file? For what? Termination. He's documenting everything. Calls her nurse dropout behind closed doors. Jennifer's voice carried the particular satisfaction of someone sharing scandal. Told me she barely passed her boards. 3rd try, apparently. The coffee dispensed with a mechanical sigh. Megan extracted the cup, the heat blooming against her palm. She didn't move. Didn't turn around. The two nurses continued their conversation, Pierce's influence spreading like infection through an open wound, each lie more detailed than the last, each repetition making the fiction more credible than any truth could be. Megan had passed her NCLEX on the first attempt. 99 percentile. Her file at the Marine Corps contained commendation letters from 3 commanding officers, each one noting her clinical decision-making under fire. But those files were sealed. Classified. And here in Denver, in this hospital, under this doctor's systematic destruction, she was simply Nurse O'Brien. The one to doubt. The one to watch. She walked back toward the nursing station, the cup warming her hands like a prayer she didn't pray anymore. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd been undercover for 14 months of absorbing insults, deflecting suspicion, maintaining the role of competent but unremarkable nurse. The Pentagon had deployed her here specifically because she could vanish into a system, become background noise, identify the gaps where illegal opioid diversions were happening in veteran wards. But Pierce had done something worse than discover her real identity. He'd created a false one and was building an institutional case against it. Strategic escalation. Efficient. Almost military in its precision. That afternoon, during rounds with Commander Harris, Pierce made his intentions explicit. The room was crowded. 3 residents, 2 medical students, a surgical fellow, and Megan standing at the foot of the bed with her assessment notes. Pierce entered with the bearing of a man who owned the space. He approached Harris's bedside, his voice modulated for the audience rather than the patient. "Commander Harris deserves the highest level of care," Pierce said, his tone suggesting this was a recent revelation he'd personally arrived at. "Which is why I want experienced nurses only on this case. O'Brien." He turned to her directly, his eyes the color of slate. "You'll observe but not touch. Consider it a learning opportunity. Watch how real professionals work." The surgical fellow winced visibly. One of the residents looked at his shoes. Megan's pen continued moving across the chart. Steady. Methodical. "Yes, doctor," she said. Her voice was flat, professional, empty of anything that could be used against her later. She closed the chart. She didn't look at Harris. She didn't acknowledge the humiliation because acknowledging it was already losing. Pierce smiled, the small, satisfied smile of a man who'd just publicly deplored someone and called it education. But that wasn't the worst part. The real damage came during the evening shift when Megan was in the break room heating a container of leftover chicken and rice. She'd been eating the same meal for 4 days straight because it was the only thing she could prepare in a hotel room microwave without drawing attention. The other nurses filtered in and out, collecting their own dinners, their own respites from the ER floor. And every time someone new arrived, the room temperature dropped 3 degrees. They were avoiding her now. Systematically. Jennifer took her food and left. Marcus, who'd asked Megan for foot technique pointers 3 weeks ago, suddenly had urgent work at the medication station. The newer nurses, the ones Megan had mentored during their first shifts, found reasons to chart in separate areas. This was how institutional destruction worked. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't one final confrontation. It was the slow removal of collaboration, the isolation of competence, the transformation of a professional into a liability that even good people had to distance themselves from. Pierce had poisoned them all with just enough doubt that protecting themselves felt like the rational choice. Megan ate her chicken and rice alone. 6 days into Commander Harris's admission, everything accelerated. His chest wound showed the first signs of trouble, inflammation at the surgical margins, slight separation of the sutured edges. Megan documented it carefully, photographed it for the record, and noted it in the chart with clinical precision. Wound margins show early signs of dehiscence. Recommend surgical evaluation for possible reclosure. She signed off and waited for Pierce to read it. He didn't call her. He didn't acknowledge the assessment. He simply restricted her from any hands-on care of the patient beyond vitals monitoring. He did this during evening rounds, speaking as if Megan wasn't standing 5 feet away. O'Brien's scope is limited on this case, he told the resident. Basic vital signs only. Any wound care, any assessment beyond what a blood pressure cuff can tell us, comes through me or the surgical team. Clear? Yes, attending, the resident said, exchanging an uncomfortable glance with Megan. Megan nodded. No argument. No pushback. Just acceptance, the way a good nurse accepted the orders of the doctor, even when those orders were designed to isolate her from a patient she could help. What she didn't say was that she recognized the tactic. She'd seen it deployed in forward operating bases by officers threatened by enlisted personnel with better instincts. The institutional response was always the same: remove their authority and wait for them to make a mistake born of frustration or desperation. Make the system work against them. Use the rules as weapons. Day 6 came with its own particular cruelty. No other nurse had been assigned to Commander Harris for his afternoon dressing change. The shift supervisor had looked apologetic when she made the rounds. "Pierce wants you to observe only, but we're short-staffed. Can you grab his vitals during the change?" "Technically that's within your scope." "Technically." The word hung in the air like poison gas. Megan found herself at Harris's bedside with the dressing kit anyway, her hands moving through the motions of routine care, removing the old gauze, assessing the site, applying new dressing. It was within her scope. It wasn't touching the wound itself, just the management of it, and Harris's blood pressure was stable at 118/76, his oxygen saturation steady at 97% on room air. Everything was normal. Everything was controlled. Except Harris himself. He'd been lucid that morning. His eyes had tracked the room with increasing awareness over the past 72 hours, though his traumatic brain injury meant his long-term memory was still fragmented, Swiss cheese, full of holes. But he was conscious. He was present. And right now, as Megan finished the dressing, he was asking the same question he'd been asking for 6 days. "Where's Meg?" His voice was rough, damaged from intubation. "Where's my Angel 6? Megan's hand paused. Just for a fraction of a second. The kind of pause that would be invisible to anyone who wasn't trained to notice the absence of motion, the stillness before a response. She didn't answer. But then Harris gasped. Not the small sound of discomfort. A sound of genuine distress. His chest heaved, the breathing irregular, and Megan looked at the monitor. In that same moment the numbers went into free fall. Blood pressure dropping from 110/70 to 95/55 to 80/40 in seconds that felt stretched like taffy. His oxygen saturation plummeted, 94, 89, 82, 76. She saw it immediately. The signs overlapping, building on each other with the terrible clarity of someone who'd seen lung collapse in field conditions. His trachea was deviating left. Jugular veins distending like they'd been inflated. His breath sounds on the left side virtually absent. Tension pneumothorax, his lung collapsing, air building pressure in the pleural space, compressing his heart. Megan slammed the code button. "I need a crash cart," she said into the intercom, her voice cutting through the ER noise like a knife. Room 347. Respiratory distress, BP dropping, possible pneumothorax. Her hands moved without thought, direct pressure on the wound edges that were now separating, elevation of his left side, positioning for airway assessment. The needle for decompression was in her head already, her muscle memory from 14 years of combat medicine running the calculations. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line, 14-gauge angiocath. She could save him. She could do this in 30 seconds. But Dr. Pierce was faster. He burst through the doors from the attending station, having monitored the code from 2 floors up, and his voice cut through the controlled urgency like a whip crack. "Step away from him. Now." Megan straightened, raising her hands. "Security." Pierce pointed at her, his face flushed with something that looked like vindication. "This nurse is unfit to touch a patient in this facility. Everyone witness it, she's practicing beyond her scope, causing patient harm." Harris's oxygen saturation hit 68. Megan stepped back, her hands raised, and watched Dr. Pierce begin his textbook ACLS protocol, each movement by the book and 17 seconds too late, each decision technically correct and fundamentally wrong, each action a man trying to save a patient while operating in ignorance of what that patient actually needed. The room went dead silent except for the sound of the code cartwheel squeaking on the tile floor. Day 6. The monitor beeped its relentless rhythm, Harris's chest rising and falling beneath clean white gauze, his vitals steady enough that Megan had charted them without flagging a single concern. The standing order from Pierce was explicit, no direct patient contact except vital checks, all dressing changes to be supervised by an attending or removed entirely from her scope. Technically, the order was hospital policy violation. Nurses performed routine wound care across every unit in St. Michael's without waiting for physician presence, but Pierce had documented it in Harris's chart with the precision of a man building a file. Megan had read it. She knew what he was doing. That mega tattoo on Harris's forearm seemed to pulse under the fluorescent panels as she prepped the sterile field, conscious of every movement, every choice to proceed rather than call for backup she knew would arrive with Pierce's voice preceding it by 30 seconds. The first layer of gauze came away clean. No signs of infection. The subcutaneous tissue beneath the dressing showed appropriate healing response, the kind of progression that meant Harris might walk out of St. Michael's in 4 weeks instead of 6. Megan worked methodically, her hands moving through the motion she'd performed 10,000 times, the muscle memory of both a nurse and a Marine flowing through the same nervous system. Fresh dressing, antibiotic ointment, the exact tension on the tape to secure without constricting. Professional. Documented. Defensible. Then Harris's blood pressure monitor beeped. Not the routine alert of a reading cycle, but the sharp insistent alarm that meant a change. Megan's eye snapped to the display, 94/52. Dropping. She looked at his chest, the wound site was seeping. Not oozing. Seeping. Blood beginning to pool beneath the fresh gauze she'd placed 90 seconds ago. His respiratory rate climbed, 28 breaths per minute, then 32. His lips were still the right color but his nail beds had begun to pale. Internal hemorrhage. Massive. Fast. Call the crash cart, Megan said, her voice level, her hands already moving to the foresight in his right arm. She was already pulling the dressing back, exposing the chest wound, and what she saw there turned her blood to ice. The edges of the surgical site were separating. Dehiscing. The careful work of the trauma surgeons who'd closed him in Tikrit was coming undone, and something beneath that closure was bleeding catastrophically into his pleural cavity. Code blue. Get me the crash cart now. The intercom crackled. A nurse appeared in the doorway, young, probably 3 years out of school. Dr. Pierce is in the. Now, Megan repeated, and the nurse moved. The cardiac monitor showed sinus tachycardia, compensatory, his heart trying to pump blood that was pouring out faster than his body could manufacture it. Harris's eyes were still closed but his right hand gripped the rail with tension that hadn't been there 5 minutes ago. His body knew. At some level beneath consciousness, his nervous system was screaming that the bleeding hadn't stopped, that the war wasn't over, that Tikrit had followed him here to this white room in Denver where someone's mistake was going to kill him. The crash cart burst through the door like a ship plowing through heavy water, aluminum edges catching the light, the kind of equipment weight that meant someone had run, not walked, down the corridor. Megan had her hand on Harris's carotid artery, feeling for the pulse, feeling it thread-thin beneath her fingers. Blood pressure 82/40. Falling. She was already lifting his gown higher, scanning his abdomen for the distension that would confirm internal bleeding, and there it was, his belly rigid beneath her palm, swollen with blood that should have been inside his vessels. Dr. Pierce arrived 8 seconds later. He didn't look at the monitors. He looked at Megan with an expression that cycled through surprise and then something harder, something that looked like satisfaction. Like he'd been waiting for this moment, for her to make exactly this mistake. Step away from the patient, Pierce said. Not a question. Not a request. The voice of a man accustomed to obedience, the kind of institutional authority that made junior residents and nursing students straighten their spines. Tension pneumothorax, Megan said. Possible traumatic re-rupture of the surgical site. He's bleeding into. I said step away. Pierce moved between her and the bed with the deliberate slowness of someone making a point. He raised his hand toward his radio. Security to the ER. Code green. Unfit staff member in a patient room. We need her removed. The other nurses froze. One of them had grabbed the crash cart and now stood with her hands on the defibrillator pads, uncertain whether to move or stay rooted to the tile floor. Harris's oxygen saturation was visible on the monitor behind Pierce, 89%, dropping. The alarm had muted but the numbers were screaming. His left lung is collapsing, Megan said quietly. Tension pneumothorax compressing his heart. Standard ACLS won't touch this. You need a needle decompression or a chest tube. What I need is you out of this facility. Pierce didn't look back. He was already calling for compressions, his hands positioning themselves on Harris's chest with the textbook precision that made residents sit up straighter during rounds. 200 joules. Get me a 12-lead EKG. Megan stepped back. There was no choice in it, not really. The security officer was already in the hallway, already moving toward the ER. Her cover was intact. Her assignment was still live. The investigation was still running. She had to let him crash. But her eyes didn't leave the monitor. 85%. 83. 80. Pierce ran the code the way he ran everything, by the book, technically flawless, a textbook ACLS protocol that would have saved 90% of cardiac arrest patients. Chest compressions with the right depth and rate. Oxygen at high flow, the bag valve mass moving in sync with the compressions. A line going into his right arm for the epinephrine, the 1 mg forepush that was supposed to restart a failing heart. Everything correct. Everything wrong. For minutes. That was how long Megan stood against the far wall, her hands curled so tightly her nails left crescents in her palms, and watched Harris's oxygen saturation plummet. 78%. His lips had turned the color of slate. His nail beds were white. The air in his chest cavity that should have been exchanging for oxygen was pressing against his heart like a fist, compressing the vena cava, preventing blood from returning to his chambers, killing him with every compression Pierce was performing. The other nurses were watching Pierce with the expression of people who wanted to speak and didn't dare. One of them, the older one, maybe 15 years on the unit, had her mouth open slightly, like she was rehearsing words that would never make it to her voice box. She'd been trained the way Megan had been trained, probably a decade ago. She knew what a tension pneumothorax looked like. She knew what was happening. But Pierce was an attending physician and she was a staff nurse, and the institutional architecture that held hospitals upright was built on exactly this power differential. 76%. 74. Megan's eyes tracked to Harris's forearm. That Emeg tattoo. The day she'd carried him through enemy fire in the Jolin district, his belly opened by shrapnel, his blood soaking through both their uniforms, his voice in her ear saying he had a daughter waiting, he had a wife at home, he couldn't die in Fallujah because there was no one to tell her goodbye. She'd run 400 meters dragging his 200-pound frame, and a piece of her own body that she hadn't understood was broken until the extraction bird was already lifting off. She'd promised him on that flight deck that he'd walk out of this war. She'd promised. 72%. The monitor showed the rhythm, still organized electrical activity on the screen, but the mechanical reality, the actual pumping of blood through a heart crushed beneath trapped air, was failing. Within 90 seconds, the rhythm would change. Within 2 minutes, the monitor would flatline. Within 4, he'd be dead. Megan moved. It wasn't a decision in any conscious sense. Her body simply acted. Her hands were already in motion toward the crash cart as Pierce called for a second round of epinephrine. She had the 14-gauge needle in her right hand before anyone recognized what was happening, before the young nurse could step forward or Pierce could turn his head. She was counting ribs with her left hand, her fingers finding the landmarks beneath Harris's ribs with the precision of hands that had done this before, in the dark, under fire, with shrapnel round singing overhead. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She felt the slight give of skin and muscle, felt the needle advance through the parietal pleura, and then the hiss. Air escaping. Escaping. The sound of breath leaving a place where breath should never have been, the sound of atmospheric pressure equalizing to pressures that had been killing him one compression at a time. The hiss lasted 2 seconds. It sounded like the earth exhaling after being held underwater. Harris's oxygen saturation began to climb. 76. 80. 82. 85. 90. What the hell are you doing? Pierce's voice cut across the room, but it wasn't the voice of a commanding physician anymore. It was the voice of a man watching his authority evaporate in real time, watching a nurse perform an emergency procedure with movement so precise, so absolutely and unmistakably military, that every medical resident in the room suddenly understood they'd been watching a person they'd fundamentally misunderstood. "Breathing," Megan said quietly. She was still holding the needle in place, using her free hand to locate the chest tube kit that was already arriving courtesy of the young nurse who'd apparently understood what was happening the moment the air had hissed free. He was suffocating. 92%. 95. The room went still in a way that had nothing to do with silence. The monitors kept their rhythm. The ventilators kept their cadence. But the space between the people in that room had transformed into something that carried weight. Megan's hands were moving without looking down, pulling the emergency chest tube into position, the kind of procedure she'd performed at battalion aid station with nothing but field training and the certainty that the alternative was death. Pierce was still standing, his hands half extended toward Harris's chest, but his eyes had narrowed to focus on Megan's movements, on the military precision, on the complete absence of hesitation that marked the difference between a nurse with a certification and someone with actual combat medicine experience. "Get her out of here," Pierce said, but his voice had changed. The authority was still there, but underneath it was something else entirely, the awareness that he'd just been erased from his own code, the realization that he'd missed something fundamental about a patient's condition, and worse, the understanding that someone with real expertise had just moved him aside like he weighed nothing. Megan didn't respond. She was too focused on the chest tube placement, on the small amount of hemopneumothorax that drained into the collection chamber, on Harris's oxygen saturation finally stabilizing at 97%, his heart rate dropping from the frantic compensatory range back into something that looked like life. His blood pressure was climbing to 96/58, then 104/62. His lips were returning to their normal color. The tension was releasing. The security officer appeared in the doorway, uncertain, looking between Pierce and Megan and the suddenly stable patient on the bed. Pierce was already on his phone, his fingers moving with the jerky precision of someone typing in anger. Megan caught fragments: administration, documentation, inappropriate conduct, practicing beyond scope, and then, "I'm filing termination paperwork effective immediately." She finished securing the chest tube without acknowledgement, her hand steady as surgical steel, and then she stepped back. The other nurses were staring. The residents were staring. Only Harris was sleeping, his body finally understanding that the threat had passed, that the bleeding had stopped, that the war had let him live another day. But Dr. Pierce was already walking toward the nurses' station, already composing the narrative that would justify what everyone had just witnessed, already deciding that the only story that could possibly survive this moment was a story in which Captain Megan O'Brien had committed the cardinal sin of exceeding her authority, and that the fact she'd done it to save a man's life was the problem, not the proof. The needle went in clean. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the precise anatomical landmark burned into muscle memory from 12 years of field medicine. The pleural space hissed as trapped air escaped, a sound like a tire deflating in a silent room, and Harris's oxygen saturation climbed in real time on the monitor. 94%. The lung was re-expanding. His color shifted from dusky blue back toward something approaching human. 8 minutes. That was all it had taken for Captain Megan O'Brien to do what Dr. Pierce's textbook protocol had failed to accomplish in 4. Pierce's eyes narrowed as he watched her hands move through the decompression with movements that didn't belong in any civilian nursing school curriculum. The way she'd angled her approach. The confidence. The absence of hesitation. His jaw tightened as the thoracic surgery team wheeled into place a proper chest tube, as Harris stabilized enough to be transferred to the ICU, as the monitor showed a heartbeat that had nearly flatlined returned to something resembling normal rhythm. The attending physician stood frozen at the edge of the trauma bay, watching a nurse execute a procedure that required military combat medic training, and something in his expression shifted from rage into calculation. By the time Harris disappeared into the elevator bound for the ICU, Pierce was already moving toward the ER break room. Already composing. Already weaponizing hospital policy like a scalpel. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and antiseptic, the fluorescent lights casting everything in a color that made human skin look like old parchment. The hospital administrator sat across from Megan at the laminate table, looking deeply uncomfortable. Pierce placed the termination paperwork in front of her with the precision of a surgeon laying out instruments. His hands were steady now. Rage had crystallized into something colder. More procedural. More final. Insubordination, Pierce said, reading from the document as if Megan hadn't already understood what was happening the moment she saw the administrator's face. Practicing beyond scope. Physical assault of an attending physician. He paused, letting the weight of that last phrase settle. Per Hospital Regulation 14.7c, a nurse who contradicts or physically interferes with an attending physician's orders during active treatment can be terminated for cause immediately. Megan read the papers in silence. Her face was a mask, not the mask of someone who was devastated, but the mask of someone who had already accepted this as the tactical consequence of her action. Commander Harris was alive. That was the only calculation that mattered. The rest was just collateral damage from a mission that had never been meant to end in a normal retirement anyway. "You're done," Pierce said, sliding the papers across the table. "Security will escort you out." She signed without reading the rest. Not because she didn't care what accusations they'd compiled, but because there was no point arguing with someone who was using bureaucracy as a weapon. The administrator looked away, uncomfortable with his role in this execution. Pierce's signature on the termination documents was trembling, not from guilt or shame, but from the kind of rage that comes from finally achieving victory through mechanisms that couldn't be challenged. Insubordination. Practicing beyond scope. Physical assault. He had weaponized hospital policy into something lethal, and now it was done. Megan stood and walked to her locker without being escorted. Security followed anyway, 2 guards in polo shirts with radios clipped to their belts, watching as she spun the combination lock. The cracked mug was exactly where she'd left it weeks ago, white ceramic with the words "World's Okayest Nurse" printed in fading black letters. She wrapped it in paper towels from the dispenser and placed it carefully in the cardboard box the administrator had provided. The succulent came next, its leaves brown and brittle from neglect, the soil hard as concrete. She didn't bother watering it. Some things weren't meant to survive. The photo came last. Her fire team from Tikrit. For Marines in desert camo, weapons slung across their chests, the kind of smiles that only exist in a moment when you've survived another day and haven't yet thought about tomorrow. 3 of the 4 faces were circled in black marker. The mark of the dead. She folded it carefully and placed it on top of the mug. In her jacket pocket, wrapped in a plastic seal, was the flag from the teammate who hadn't made it out. The flag from the ceremony where they delivered the news to his mother. She placed it carefully in the box, making sure it was protected. Then she walked out of St. Michael's with a cardboard box balanced on her hip like she was carrying groceries. 2 days later, Denver rain was falling in sheets that looked like someone had thrown 1,000 buckets from the sky. Megan stood at a bus stop on Federal Boulevard, the cardboard box soaking through at the bottom, water dripping from her hair and running down her neck. Her jacket was dark with rain, her shoes covered in gutter mud from where a passing car had sprayed through a puddle. She didn't move. Didn't seek shelter. Just shifted the box to her other hip and checked the schedule posted behind scratched plexiglass. The photo of her fire team was getting wet. She covered it with her hand, shielding it the way you'd shield a child in a storm. The bus was 7 minutes late. In 7 minutes, her cover would either hold or it wouldn't. In 7 minutes, her identity as Captain Megan O'Brien, United States Marine Corps, working under federal assignment to investigate opioid diversion in veteran wards, would either remain classified or it would be exposed by the background check that St. Michael's HR was running as part of their standard termination procedures. She had known this was a possibility when she performed that needle decompression. She had known her hands had betrayed her, moving with the precision of military training instead of civilian nursing school technique. She had known that Pierce was smart enough to connect those dots eventually, probably after he'd cooled down and stopped thinking like an angry man and started thinking like a doctor with something to hide. What she hadn't known was how fast the Pentagon moved when a classified operative's cover was about to be blown. The rain intensified, drumming against the bus shelter's metal roof with a sound like distant gunfire. Megan's phone vibrated in her pocket. A single text from a number she'd memorized but never dialed, retrieve your credentials now. We're inbound. She didn't respond. Responses left digital traces. She just stood in the rain with a cardboard box full of memories, waiting for the bus that would never come because there were better ways to move people off the grid than public transportation. When the car pulled up, unmarked sedan, government plates, she didn't look surprised. She just stepped out of the rain shelter and opened the rear passenger door, placing the cardboard box carefully on the seat next to her. The driver was a young Marine in civilian clothes, jaw tight, eyes forward. He didn't ask questions. He just pulled into traffic and drove toward a destination she was about to find out. St. Michael's HR flagged your clearance during termination processing, the driver said after 3 blocks of silence. Automatic cascade to the Pentagon. General Mitchell is already briefed. Megan closed her eyes. 6 months of work. 6 months of enduring Pierce's humiliation, of swallowing his insults, of watching him sabotage her credibility with surgical precision. 6 months of watching Commander Harris struggle through his recovery while the man supposed to be healing him withheld proper care out of ego and territorial dominance. 6 months of an undercover assignment designed to last another 8 weeks at minimum, now compressed into a single moment of muscle memory so precise it had blown apart every cover story she'd constructed. What about Harris? She asked. Transferred to Landstuhl for specialist rehabilitation, the driver said. He's stable. Pentagon's already pulled his records. They're classifying his entire case now. From the hospital's perspective, he was just another trauma admission who got lucky. The good doctor will never know how close that man came to being another statistic in his medical negligence file. The car turned onto a side street, heading away from downtown Denver. Megan watched the rain streak across the window, watched the city blur into gray lines of streetlights and neon signs. Her phone vibrated again. Conference room. Dress blues. Now. She looked down at the cardboard box. The cracked mug. The dying succulent. The photo of 3 dead Marines and one who still had a chance to remember why he was alive. The folded flag from the ceremony that had marked her transition from healer to investigator. I need the box, she said quietly. The driver didn't question it. He just pulled over at a red light and waited while she retrieved her belongings, while she made sure the flag was still protected and the photo was still dry. When she walked into the Pentagon conference room in dress blues with captain's insignia that had never appeared on any St. Michael's Hospital ID, she would be walking into a reckoning. But first, she needed to make sure the things that mattered didn't get lost. The red light turned green. The car accelerated into the rain. The rain had stopped by the time the background check notification hit St. Michael's Hours system. Tuesday morning, 9:43 a.m., a routine document retrieval for termination processing, standard procedure to ensure final paychecks, benefits documentation, and severance paperwork moved smoothly. The HR director, a woman named Patricia who'd worked in healthcare administration for 17 years, was reviewing Megan's file when the computer flagged something that made her hands go cold. A classified security clearance. Not expired. Not inactive. Active. Pentagon level. Which meant one of 2 things: either the hospital had been harboring someone who'd committed fraud, or someone had infiltrated their staff with authorization so compartmentalized that not even their own system knew the truth. Patricia picked up the phone. Then put it down. Then picked it up again and dialed a number that wasn't in her contact list but appeared on a laminated card in her desk drawer, a card placed there during hospital credentialing 3 years ago by someone she'd only met once, who'd said exactly 6 words before walking away: keep this. Tell no one. Ever. She didn't use that number lightly. Nobody used that number lightly. The call was answered on the second ring. No greeting. Just a pause, then, confirm your facility location. St. Michael's Medical Center, Denver, Colorado. Another pause. Longer this time. Then, stand by for retrieval protocols. Secure your HR terminal. Do not discuss with any staff member. A liaison will arrive within the hour. Authenticate their credentials before providing any documentation. Do you understand? I understand. The line went dead. Patricia locked her office door, closed her blinds, and waited. 52 minutes later, marine dress blues appeared in her doorway, a tall man with a bearing like someone who'd spent his entire career being the calmest person in catastrophic situations. Major Tom Holloway, he introduced himself, showing credentials that shifted between holograms depending on the angle of the light. He spent 20 minutes reviewing Megan's file in silence, then turned to Patricia with an expression that suggested he was simultaneously solving 3 equations and calculating which ones would matter. Has anyone accessed her personnel file other than standard HR processes? Dr. Pierce. He's the attending physician who terminated her. He filed the discharge paperwork yesterday. Holloway's jaw tightened. The pause lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then, I need to speak with hospital administration. Now. And I need security to detain Dr. Pierce in a private location where he can observe what's about to happen without being observed himself. The administrator, a man named Dr. Kevin Santos who'd been running St. Michael's for 9 years, received Holloway in his office at 10:33 a.m. By 11:15 a.m., security had escorted Dr. Pierce to an observation room overlooking Commander Harris's hospital suite, told only that there was an administrative matter requiring his presence while they sorted the discharge documentation. Pierce protested, demanded to know what was happening, was told to sit down and wait. He complied, because at some level he understood he'd stepped on something larger than hospital politics, but the understanding hadn't yet crystallized into fear. Not yet. In Commander Harris's room, Megan stood adjusting the flow rate with her usual mechanical precision, the kind of composure that came from having done it 5,000 times before, but never in a room about to explode. Holloway entered first. Then Dr. Santos. Then a woman in the dress uniform of a Pentagon legal advisor. Then, finally, 2 uniformed officers from the 160th SO Aviation Regiment, carrying tablets and wearing the kind of tactical patience that meant they'd done this exact thing before in 7 different countries. Harris's eyes flicked toward Megan, then back to the major. His hand rose slightly off the blanket, a Marine asking permission to move. At ease, Commander, Holloway said. Captain O'Brien is cleared for this briefing. Captain. The word landed like a defibrillator shock. Harris's head turned toward Megan, his eyes widening in a recognition that went beyond simple understanding. It was the moment when 1,000 fragments of memory that trauma had shattered suddenly tried to reassemble themselves. His hand rose, moving slowly, and gripped Megan's wrist with the trembling strength of someone who'd spent 6 weeks believing his last memory of her was the moment he'd blacked out in Tikrit. His lips moved, testing sounds, and then Angel 6. It was her call sign. The name she hadn't heard in 4 months, spoken by someone she'd carried through enemy fire believing he would never remember her carrying him. Megan's hand went very still. For the first time in St. Michael's, her composure shifted, not broken, but transformed. She placed her other hand on top of Harris's, and nodded. Once. Holloway stepped forward, and his voice filled the room with the weight of institutional authority reading something into existence that had been sealed in classified files for 6 months. Captain Megan Marie O'Brien, United States Marine Corps, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. This citation is being recorded for official record for extraordinary valor in Tikrit, Jolin District, 18 months ago, during combat operations. Then Lieutenant O'Brien identified a critically wounded commanding officer in a hot zone during enemy engagement and, under sustained small arms fire and IED detonation, extracted said officer through 340 meters of active combat terrain to a secure extraction point, performing field stabilization that prevented exsanguination and enabled survival. Silver Star. Effective immediately, you are restored to active duty status with all associated clearances and commendations. Pierce watched from the observation room, his face going the color of weathered concrete. The administrator cleared his throat and spoke quietly into the silence that followed. Dr. Pierce's attempted deletion of security footage from the night of Commander Harris's crash was discovered by our IT systems, flagged automatically per federal record-keeping protocols. Navy vet named Rodriguez in IT. He saved every frame. Dr. Santos produced a tablet. Would you like to watch it, Dr. Pierce, or should we just proceed to the investigation findings? Pierce sputtered. His voice cracked when he spoke. This is absurd. That nurse, Captain O'Brien, she violated protocol. She assaulted me. She had no authority to. Your professional standards are under review, the Pentagon legal advisor said flatly. That conversation happens with lawyers present, not here. What happens here is you watch the evidence of your conduct. The footage played on a laptop that Holloway angled so everyone could see. Timestamp, 11:11 p.m., night of Harris's crash. Commander Harris on the stretcher, vitals tanking, respiratory distress mounting. Oxygen saturation dropping. O2 sat 68. 64, 60. Tracheal deviation visible on the left side of his neck, a medical emergency announcement in itself. And Dr. Pierce, standing beside the stretcher, talking. Gesticulating toward residents. Talking. Running a textbook ACLS protocol while Harris's lung was collapsing. One nurse, not Megan, a different nurse, a woman named Yuki from the day shift, pointing toward the deviation, speaking, mouth visible saying tracheal shift, and Pierce, without looking at Harris, waving her off with a dismissive gesture. For minutes and 17 seconds. That's how long Pierce talked while ignoring what his eyes should have been seeing. Then Megan appeared in the frame, moving with the precision of someone whose training had been purchased through deployment in hostile territory. The needle appeared. The hiss of air escaping. O2 sat climbing, 62, 68, 71, 75, 81, 88. Stable. The footage ended. Pierce's hands trembled. Actually trembled, sitting alone in that observation room, while 6 floors below, the room containing his victim filled with the quiet authority of people who'd already decided his future and were only explaining it to him out of procedural courtesy. Dr. Pierce's medical license is suspended effective immediately, Santos said. His voice carried no anger, which somehow made it worse. Pending criminal review by the Colorado Medical Board and federal investigators. You're to remain available for questioning and will surrender your credentials to security prior to leaving the building. This is a witch hunt, Pierce's voice cracked through the intercom. That nurse assaulted me. I have witnesses. You have nobody, the Pentagon legal advisor said without looking at him. The residents you were teaching are currently providing statements describing your conduct. The nursing staff are providing statements. And we have 17 other cases in your treatment history where you systematically dismissed care recommendations from former military nurses, the same nurses you spent months publicly denigrating. 3 of those cases resulted in formal family complaints that your position allowed you to suppress. 1 case resulted in a veteran's death that your hospital classified as the expected outcome. We're exhuming that case. We're reviewing your financial records. We're interviewing every nurse you've humiliated in this hospital, and we're tracing whether any opioid diversion, the thing that brought Captain O'Brien here in the first place, traces back to your willingness to dismiss her and others like her. The silence that followed tasted like copper and burnt rubber and the particular flavor of a man understanding that his career wasn't ending due to bureaucratic procedure. It was ending due to criminal exposure. Security walked him out 40 minutes later, his white coat already off his shoulders, his badge surrendered, his hands shaking in a way that suggested he finally understood the magnitude of what he'd tried to destroy. The drive to downtown Denver, where a detention facility was already prepared for the criminal intake process, took 17 minutes. The first official charge, obstruction of justice through destruction of evidence, carried federal sentencing guidelines that a defense attorney would spend the next 3 years trying to negotiate down. But that was happening in a courtroom, in the future tense. Right now, in Commander Harris's room, Holloway was explaining the full scope of what Megan had actually been doing for the last 6 months. The opioid diversion investigation. The real reason she'd accepted the assignment to infiltrate St. Michael's. The discovery that a pharmacy technician had been diverting fentanyl patches meant for post-operative pain management. The secondary discovery that Dr. Pierce had been deliberately blocking a veteran nurse's complaints about medication discrepancies, blocking them because those complaints made him look bad, because they came from someone he'd already decided was beneath his notice. the third discovery, that Harris himself had reported the discrepancies to a superior officer in Tikrit before his deployment, which meant Harris had become a witness, which meant Harris's wounds and Pierce's interference nearly erased the one person who could have corroborated the investigation. "Your presence here," Holloway said to Megan, "prevented that erasure. You stayed in character. You didn't break. And in doing so, you protected a witness that 3 agencies are now very interested in speaking with." Harris's grip on Megan's hand tightened. His eyes closed. For a moment, no one spoke. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. The heart monitor beeped its steady confirmation, alive, alive, alive. Later, after Holloway and his team left, after the Pentagon legal advisor had provided Megan with a phone number and a message, "Report for active duty status review in 2 weeks, your undercover assignment is terminated, Captain," Megan stood at the window of Harris's room, looking out at Denver spread beneath cloud cover like a city learning how to breathe again. Harris spoke first. His voice was still ragged from the ventilator, but steady. "You carried me 400 meters. 340, Megan said. "I don't remember." "I know. But my arm," Harris raised his left forearm, the one with her name tattooed in crude military script. "I remember you. Not the moment. But I remember you. That's something." Megan looked at the tattoo. Someone's idea of immortality, written in ink before trauma had stolen the memory that inspired it. She'd never asked him about it, all those weeks pretending to be nothing more than a competent nurse who happened to be good with patients. She'd just accepted the fact of it the way you accept scars. "It's something," she agreed. She had 2 weeks before she had to report, before her life shifted again into something wearing a uniform and a rank and an actual name on official documents. 2 weeks to exist in the strange space between identities, no longer undercover, not quite back in the Marines, suspended in the particular stillness that comes after the mission ends and the adrenaline drains out and you're just left with the weight of what you actually did. But that weight, she understood, was the whole point. Some people needed to know. Some people, like Harris, needed to understand that the person who'd saved them had made a choice to be invisible while doing it, had accepted professional humiliation and daily degradation from someone like Dr. Pierce because the mission required it, because sometimes the quietest person in the room was the one holding it all together. If you want to hear what happens when a hospital tries to fire the one nurse who actually has the Marines watching her back, like this video and subscribe. And if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your actual credentials, drop a comment and tell me your story.